I'm Graham. I'm the owner of Bike Bros, a bike shop in Cochrane, Alberta, Canada. I do these video reviews so I can tell people about bikes and we can look at details, discuss suitability, who might like bikes and who might not. I watch a lot of YouTube and I realize that I get really annoyed when people tell me to wait till the end to find something out. So, because I hate that, I'm going to make you do it too. I hate this bike. And if you stick around a little bit, I'm going to tell you why. But first, I'm going to tell you about all the details and we're going to look at all the parts on this bike. So, stick with me. I don't know if you noticed, but during that intro, I'm wearing a Marin hat. I have Marin t-shirts, socks, jerseys, even bibs, all sorts of stuff. It's because I'm a huge fan of Marin. And this particular bike just has one thing that kind of irks me. But before we get to that, I do want to go over it because there's a bunch of things that I do like on it. This is the 2023 Marin San Quentin 1. It is the first price point of 3 different San Quentins that Marin makes. Marin basically calls this bike a light dirt jump enduro hardtail. It, along with its 2 fancier siblings, all come with 27.5 inch wheels, relatively short rear end, really slack head tube angle, and they are designed to be ridden pretty aggressively. This particular one, the San Quentin one, is $1,279 in Canada, or $9.99 US dollars. Its more fancy brethren are the San Quentin 2, which is $18.99 in Canada, or $14.99 in the US, or the San Quentin 3, which is $25.49 in Canada, or $19.99 in the United States. And they each have noticeable improvements in both the frame and the bits and pieces. But for today, we're looking at the San Quentin 1, and I'm going to show you a bunch of the bits and pieces on this bike. So at the end of this whole thing, you are going to know this bike well, and maybe you'll see if you agree with my reasons for not liking this, or if you're one of the people who, for the exact same reason I don't like it, you may turn out to really like it. So that's where we're going to go next, is specs, talking about some numbers, and that thing that bugs me. So Marin likes to call this frame a Series 2 aluminum frame. In Marin talk, Series 2 basically means that we're looking at a frame that has a traditional quick release rear end, and that there isn't a pile of fanciness built into the way dropouts or frame profiling is done. Other than that, it's going to be a high quality, durable aluminum frame. So starting with details here, this is a microSHIFT Advent 9-speed derailleur on here. It has a clutch. Once again, for all the videos you've watched of mine, I show you the clutch adds some spring tension when it's off, reduces that spring tension when it's off. The reason that they give you an off position for that is so if you get a flat tire, you're not going to be battling a bunch of chain tension to get your rear wheel off. You have a 9-speed Sunrace cassette on here, and its range of gears goes from 11 to 46 teeth, so a pretty wide range of gears for most sort of regular undulating trails that you won't be searching for more gears. Along with that, it has a KMC chain and a steel stamped narrow wide chainring on the front here. That chainring is a 34 tooth, and the cranks that it attach, or the cranks attach by a square taper bottom bracket. So if you're a really heavy person, the one thing I would caution is if you take this sort of description of this bike to heart, that square taper crankset, they can be more susceptible to rounding out if you're doing drops or jumps. So just a thing to keep in mind. It is a relatively standard option that you're seeing on bikes at this $1,200-ish sort of price point. So I wouldn't say that it's a downfall of the bike, but something to keep in mind if you read the sort of marketing material with San Quentins and you think, yeah, I'm 220 pounds and I can still go huck this thing at the local skate park or pump track. I would say exercise caution there. The wheels are 27.5. The rims are a Marin branded 29mm internal rim, and they are tubeless compatible. However, the tires themselves on these, they're a V tire flow snap, 27.5 by 2.6. They are not listed as being tubeless compatible. So if you ever did want to ride this tubeless, which would allow you to ride a little bit softer tires and get a bit more compliance out of the tires, you would have to switch the tires. On these, the comment I would say is these tires don't tend to get good marks for their performance in slick rock type areas, and that's using Hardtail Party's review of this bike. I would say the inverse of that is if they don't work on slick rock and they have this sort of tread profile, it's because they're designed for a place that has more dirt than slick rock. So our particular area, Western Canada, we would have a lot of mixed terrain, and so these may end up being a medium performing tire, and they will have their place where they shine, being the softer, more loamy stuff. So not necessarily a bad tire, but just something to keep in mind. They also aren't fast rolling. That is one thing that we hear about these. So that just means that it feels like you're gonna put a little bit more energy into getting this bike moving. We have a 30.9 seat post on here. So 30.9 is important to us so that these bikes, I think, really, if you want to ride them on a trail a lot, putting a dropper seat post on here is going to be something that's going to interest you. And they do provide us with a port. It's not super obvious, but right in the center of your screen there, that is the plug where the cable would be run internally on this side of the frame here, come out below the frame, wrap around, and then come back in. And this port is really, really low down the seat tube, so I don't think that it's going to hinder the ability to run a seat post really, really far into the seat tube here. And I think that the frame routing, the cable routing is pretty easy. Remembering this is a price point-ish bike, so even just getting a nice internal cable routing is a pretty nice feature. The brakes on here are Tektro 275s. I would say if you see Tektros on bikes under about $1,500, $2,000, this is pretty much the model of brake that you'll almost always see. They have gone as far as putting 180mm rotors on the front and the rear on this. So that's at least showing that they're thinking about a little bit more aggressive riding, where a lot of bikes would still have a 160mm rotor, at least on the rear, if not on both. This is just showing that we do have a quick release skewer on here. They've got spots here, not that it matters, for fenders and rack, in case somebody wants an extreme dirt jumping bikepacking bike. I don't think that that's of value, but I think what is basically happening is that the dropout that they use on this bike is probably shared between a few different models. Getting back to the cranks, all of the bike sizes feature 170mm cranks. So they're doing that to try and reduce the likelihood of pedal strikes, and even compared to a few years ago when the most common size was 175, well, we have a few percent shorter cranks, so a few percent less likelihood of rounding out that square taper. And speaking of that, that is a cartridge bottom bracket, which means we're looking at a threaded bottom bracket, not a press fit or anything. And walking back around to the other side, I should also note that even on this, the entry-level version of this bike, are ISCG tabs, which means you could mount a chain device on this. So if you wanted to get this and then ride it really aggressively, that'll give you a place to put a chain watching device to reduce likelihood of being able to knock your chain off. The chain stays on this bike, so part of what keeps this bike to be quite a lively bike are 425mm long, and the seat tube angle 77 degrees, so that's right in the mix with really hardcore hardtails. The head tube on this bike, or head angle on this bike, 64 degrees, and on a size large we have a 470mm reach, which I think is right in the mix for a good modern hardtail. As we move to the front of the bike, nice to see a tapered head tube on the bike, so that means yes, you can upgrade forks to something that's tapered. The fork in this particular case is a Suntour XCM 34. The 34 part of the name means that these stanchions are 34 millimeters. Almost everything else that we see at this price point is going to have 30 or 32 millimeter stanchions. So this is basically keeping in mind the fact that they are talking about this being a bike designed for a bit more aggressive use. And those thick stanchions will certainly stiffen up the front end of the bike. Going along with that stiffness, it also makes sense then that we have a Thru-Axle on the front wheel. So we don't have it on the back, but we do have it on the front. It is more important on the front because that Thru-Axle is helping to tie both our legs to each other with a structural axle, so we don't have the forks wanting to kind of do any slight twisting or anything like that under heavy, severe usage. Marin handlebars, a nice short stem on this. Let me just see on my notes, where the heck do they say? I think stem length is like 35 or 45 millimeters on all of the sizes. Bars, 780 millimeters wide, which is a pretty standard width these days. Slide-on Marin grips. If any of you know my standard gripes about bikes, I don't like slide-on grips. But, I mean, at this price you don't see lock-ons all too often. That shows our little port there with a little rubber plug for where your dropper cable could be. Our detailing of the decals, showing where the rear derailleur cable and rear brake hose go. Some of the details with that little gusset, which that's one of the big new changes on this bike, is they've now got this more integrated gusset, where that used to be sort of a separate bar that would go up here on the previous version of the San Quentin. So on these new ones, what we see is a change in that feature, a slacker head tube angle and steeper seat tube angle and longer reach numbers. All those things have changed on the new bike, and this is where I get into my gripe of this bike. This particular bike is a size large. I am typically a size large myself. I'm 6'1" and I have really long legs, and I could not ride this bike. In fact, I probably couldn't even ride an XL in this bike. Not because of reach, but because they have erred so much towards this seat tube length being ultra short so you can run really long dropper posts. I think they screwed up. This bike in a size large and a size extra large are basically bikes that in one way are built for tall people, but in another way, if you're going to use it as a trail bike, you may be stuck not being able to get your seat height to work. So that is the thing I hate about this bike. I was a huge fan of the previous San Quentin. I built up a custom large because I just wanted to try it out, and I liked it quite a bit. This one, I couldn't, even if I wanted to. So I'm going to put my a few thoughts into this, and I'm going to come back with a little bit about who this might fit if it doesn't fit me, some positives, some negatives, and a bit of a summary so you can figure out if this bike is something you should consider. So I'm going to start with some negatives. So my big negative on this is actual large and extra large size riders need not apply. This bike is not going to work well for you. If you're a smaller or mediumer sized rider, I would say either really short legs, maybe up to my height of 6'1", or ideally I would say in the sort of 5'2" to 5'11" range. I think that a small, medium to large size in this bike could be really useful for you. Now, there is also things like the Rocky Mountain Growler that I would suggest to the taller riders, and that is for a couple reasons. The 27.5 wheels on here are going to make this bike quite nimble. We have a couple features on this bike that sort of argue against each other. 27.5 wheels, super nimble, yet a really slack head tube basically is trying to make a bike stable, especially at speed. So that's where I get a little bit of confusion on this bike. That's where I think overall this bike really suits a smaller rider, because then If you're riding steeps, you're not going to have the issue of tucking behind your saddle on some steeps, or if you have to sort of do a steep rollover. 27.5 is going to agree with you a lot. If you're taller, and if you don't kind of fit with the seat length on this bike, then I think you're probably better served on, for the bikes that we sell at least, Giant Fathom or a Rocky Mountain Growler. So that would be probably my big knocks, is that super short seat tube that doesn't make sense. And for people who are looking for just the smoothest, most confidence-inspiring ride, the 27.5 wheels might be a bit of a confusing sort of a bit for you. But I was one of the few people who was extremely proud and happy with the whole plus size movement. This bike here, being 27.5 by 2.6, it still has room that if you can track down some 27.5 by 2.8 tires, I think when the time comes to move on from these tires and go tubeless, if this thing was set up with 2.8 tires, you could have yourself a super fun bike. What can happen with that then, with 27.5 wheels and 2.8 tires, is if you ride them in the sort of 16, 17 PSI range, although the actual circles you're riding on are not quite the diameter of 29, because your tire becomes so compliant, you can actually get as smooth a ride and you get amazing confidence, especially if you're working on cornering skills, riding steeps where you really need some traction. So that would be my upgrades, is down the road, consider turning this bike into a 27.5 by 2.8 tired bike. They've built in enough room that I don't feel like I'm stretching, saying that it's going to be able to handle that. No issue on the frame. The fork has plenty of room, and you could turn this thing into a pretty special little beast of a bike. I did also note that while watching the hardtail party review on this bike, he didn't like the low front end on this bike. To me, it seemed Marin was quite generous, giving us a full 3 centimeters of headset spacers, which is typically sort of considered to be sort of max on most steer tubes. But go up to something like a Chromag Fu 40 handlebar, and I think if that's something that you're worried about, that is how you could fix it. If, for a lot of people, especially because I'm basically recommending this bike in small and medium and the first half of a size large, I personally don't think that this front end is too low, but if you're sensitive to it, upgrade the handlebars. You're going to need some pedals. Get some of those new Marin Oso pedals that I just reviewed yesterday. Drivetrain, this Advent 9-speed is a pretty solid drivetrain. For regular riding, I would say that even these M275 Tektro brakes, they're actually not bad. They're not high performance, but they're pretty reliable and they just do their thing. So this has been my quick rundown of the Marin San Quentin 1. This is the first price point. Oh, I forgot to mention a weight, and that's because I forgot to weigh this before I brought it to the studio to film. I am going to, once I get this back in the shop, I'm going to weigh it, and I'll put that down in the show notes. So my apologies, because I know some people come to these videos trying to get the weights. But I hope that you got an idea of how all these close-up look on this bike, some of the details, this nice tan to fade with the red Marin. It's another great Marin bike, just not a great Marin bike for this 6'1" old dude. So, hopefully you know more about bikes now than you did half an hour ago. Talk to you later. Oh, subscribe, like, all that sort of stuff. If you're still here, I suspect that you probably want to watch more of these videos.